It's part 9 of The Sunflower by Simon Wiesenthal, and the dying soldier continues with his confession to Simon. Our rest period didn't last long. Toward midday, we resumed the advance. We were now part of the storm troops. We mounted the trucks and were transported to the firing line, but here too there was not much to be seen of the enemy. He had evacuated villages and small towns, giving them up without a fight. There were only occasional skirmishes as the enemy retreated. Peter, my friend, was wounded. Karl Heinz killed. Then we had another rest with time to wash up and to write letters. Talk centred on different subjects, but there was hardly a word said about the happenings in Netropofox, where the families had been burned in the house. I went to see Peter. He had been shot in the abdomen, but was still conscious. He recognized me and looked at me with tears in his eyes. I sat down by him and he told me he was soon to be taken to hospital. He said, "The people in that house, you know what I mean?" Then he lost consciousness. Poor Peter. He died with the memory of the most dreadful experience of his life. I now heard footsteps in the corridor. I looked towards the door, which might open at any moment, and stood up. "But he stopped me," said Simon. "Do stay," said the soldier. "The nurse is waiting outside. Nobody will come in. I won't keep you much longer, but I still have something important to say." I sat down again, unwillingly, but made up my mind to depart as soon as the nurse returned. What could this man still have to tell me? That he was not the only person who had murdered Jews? That he was simply a murderer among murderers? He resumed his soul-searching. In the following weeks, we advanced towards the Crimea. Rumour had it that there was hard fighting in front of us. The Russians were well entrenched. It wasn't going to be a walkover anymore, but close fighting, man to man. The soldier paused for breath. The pauses were becoming more frequent. Obviously, he was overtaxing his strength. His breathing was irregular. His throat seemed to dry up. His hand groped for a glass of water. I didn't move. He appeared content as long as he was aware of my presence. He found the glass and gulped down some water. He sighed and whispered, "My God, my God." Was he talking about God? But God was absent. He was on leave, as the woman in the ghetto had said. Yet we all needed him. We all longed to see signs of his omnipresence. For this dying man, however, and for his like, there could be no God. The Führer had taken his place, and the fact that their atrocities remained unpunished merely strengthened their belief that God was a fiction, a hateful Jewish invention. They never tired of trying to prove it, but now this man who was dying here in bed was asking for God. He went on. The fighting in the Crimea lasted for weeks. We had severe losses. Everywhere military cemeteries sprang up. I heard they were well tended, and on every grave were growing sunflowers. I like flowers. There are many in my uncle's garden. I used to lie on the grass for hours and admire the flowers. Did he know already that he would get a sunflower when he was buried? The murderer would own something even when he was dead. And I? Well, we were approaching Tangarog, which was a strongly held village held by the Russians. We lay among the hills, he said, barely 100 yards from them. Their artillery fire was incessant. We cowered in the trenches and tried to conquer our fear by drinking from the brandy flasks passed from hand to hand. We waited for the order to attack. It came at last, and we climbed out of the trenches and charged. But suddenly I stopped, as though rooted to the ground. Something seized me. My hands, which held my rifle with fixed bayonet, began to tremble. In a moment I saw the burning family, the father with the child, and behind them the mother, and they came to meet me. No, I cannot shoot them a second time. The thought flashed through my mind, and then a shell exploded by my side, and I lost consciousness. When I awoke in hospital, I knew that I had lost my eyesight. My face and my upper part of my body were torn to ribbons. The nurse told me that the surgeon had taken a whole basin full of shell splinters out of my body. It was a miracle that I was still alive. Even now, I'm as good as dead. He sighed. His thoughts were once again centered on himself, and he was filled with self-pity. The pain became more and more unbearable, he said. My whole body is covered with marks from pain-killing injections. I was taken from one field hospital to another, but they never sent me home. That was the real punishment for me. I wanted to go home to my mother. I knew what my father would say in his inflexible severity, but my mother, she would look at me with other eyes. I saw that he was torturing himself. He was determined to gloss over nothing, said Simon. Once again he groped for my hand, but I had withdrawn it some time before and was sitting on it out of his reach. I didn't want to be touched by the hand of death. He sought my pity, but had he any right to pity? Did a man of his kind deserve anybody's pity? Did he think he would find pity if he pitied himself? Look, he said, those Jews died quickly. They did not suffer as I do, though they were not as guilty as I am. At this point I stood up to go. I, the last Jew in his life, but he held me fast with his white, bloodless hand. Whence could a man drained of blood derive such strength? He continued, I was taken from one hospital to another. They never sent me home, but I told you that before. I am well aware of my condition, and all the time I've been lying here, I have never stopped thinking of the terrible deed in that house. If only I had not survived that shell. But I can't die yet, although I have often longed to die. Sometimes I hoped that the doctor would give me an injection to put me out of my misery. I have indeed asked him to put me to sleep, but he has no pity for me. I know he has released other dying men from their sufferings by means of injections. Perhaps he is deterred by my youth. On the board at the foot of my bed is only my name, but also my date of birth. Perhaps that keeps him back. So I lie here waiting for death. The pains in my body are terrible, but though still the pain is in my conscience, it never ceases to remind me of the burning house and the family that jumped from the window. He then lapsed into silence, seeking for words. He wants something from me. I thought, for I could not imagine that he had brought me here merely as an audience. When I was still a boy, I believed with my mind and soul in God and in the commandments of the church, he said. Then everything was easier. If I still had that faith, I am sure death would not be so hard. I cannot die without coming clean. This must be my confession, he said. But what sort of confession is this? A letter without an answer? No doubt he was referring to my silence, but what could I say? He was a dying man, a murderer who did not want to be a murderer, but who had been made into a murderer by a murderous ideology. He was confessing his crime to a man who perhaps tomorrow must die at the hands of these same murderers. In his confession there was true repentance, even though he did not admit it in so many words. Nor was it necessary, for the way he spoke and the fact that he spoke to me was proof of his repentance. Believe me, he said, I would be ready to suffer worse and longer pains if by that means I could bring back the dead at the house. Many young Germans of my age die daily on the battlefields. They have fought against an armed enemy and have fallen in the fight, but I am left here with my guilt. In the last hours of my life, you are with me. I do not know who you are. I only know that you are a Jew, and that is enough. I said nothing. The truth was that on his battlefield he had also fought against defenseless men, women, and children, and the aged. I could imagine them enveloped in flames, jumping from the windows to certain death. He sat up and put his hands together as if to pray. I want to die in peace, and so I need. What did he need? Part 10 next week. Shabbat Shalom, Mike Fryer.